Okay, so today we're going to be discussing the differences in social influence as seen in Milgram's obedience experiment. Jason Berger wrote an article highlighting different situational factors that help push forward the ideas that social influence affected the participants' obedience, and that has continued our research today into into the obedience of common people. So there's some background information on social influence. Social influence is the idea of conformity, which is changing one's behavior due to the influence of others. There are multiple different types of social influence. Informational is one of them, and it's the need to know what's right. We see others as a source of information, and we tend to value what they perceive a situation as above our own perception and allow their perception to influence our behavior in that situation. If you are practicing informational social influence and you're unaware of this practice, you value private acceptance and public compliance. So private acceptance is like agreeing with the other person's perception, and public compliance is actively showcasing that agreement and changing your behaviors. The public compliance is the conformity. And you're more likely to conform in a couple different situations. When the situation is really ambiguous, where you have no direction, you're more likely to look towards experts. In a crisis situation, you're definitely going to look at other people's perception of the crisis and adjust accordingly. But this is very dangerous, being that in a crisis situation, you're not always behaving logically. And so trusting other people's kind of perception isn't always safe, especially due to contagion, which is the rapid spread of emotions or behaviors through a crowd. So that's often seen in a crisis situation because everyone starts to panic. And then another situation where you're more likely to conform in an informational social influence aspect is when other people are experts. You're more likely to value an expert's opinion over your own opinion. Normative social influence is another variant of social influence in general, and it's the need to be accepted by others. So humans on their own are a very social species, and they need human contact. When human contact is deprived, then there's a lot of anxiety, there's stress, and it's very traumatic for the human body. And this is seen in our different brain functions. When you go along with normative social influence, then your vision and your perception areas of your brain are more active. Whereas if you don't comply, then your amygdala and the right caudate nucleus are active, and the amygdala is associated with the negative emotions. So the unlikeliness to conform is associated with negativity. And in normative social influence, you don't always agree with what other people are saying. There's not always that private acceptance, but there's generally the public compliance. So that can be seen in the Osh's line study. That's a very common study that we cite to discuss normative influence, where when you see other people agreeing with the wrong answer, even though you know it's wrong, you're more likely to conform because you don't want people to shut you out. You don't want them to talk about you. It's kind of this idea of how you value yourself. Finally, the last area of social influence that we discussed was the minority influence. And that's a very politically charged influence in today's society. It's often discussed amongst politicians and lobbyists. So the main thing about minority influence is the consistency of it. If all the people don't say the same thing around the same time, then it's not going to be effective because it is the minority influencing the majority. And this can be seen through injunctive norms and descriptive norms. So injunctive norms are people's perception of what others approve of. So if you're a politician and it's the right wing versus left wing, what do people approve of? And then descriptive norms are people's perception of how people actually act. So even though something is approved doesn't mean that people are necessarily going to do it, and just because something's disapproved of doesn't mean people aren't going to not do it. So that's kind of what minority social influence is. And there are a couple of compliance techniques. These are more towards obedience, which going into Milgram's study, these are very important. The foot in the door technique is very important, because if people, it's the idea of like agreeing to something small and advancing to something large. So if you're more likely to agree to a small task, like flipping a switch on a very low voltage, then as you go on, you're more likely to flip a higher switch that can induce a greater shock. Whereas door in the face technique is the opposite, asking someone to do something really, really large first, and then switching, and then like ask them to do small things over time. Because if you agree to the large thing, then you're more likely to agree to the small things because they don't seem as a big of a deal in comparison. And then the last compliance technique that we see in our society today very prevalently is propaganda, and it's just the systematic attempt to advance a cause. So this is often seen in minority social influence, putting out facts that may not necessarily even be true just to manipulate the mass attitudes. So the main discussion today is Milgram's study and the 4 situational factors that kind of cause the obedience and how social influence is in these factors. So a little bit of background on Milgram's study was that 63% of participants delivered the full shock. Most of us are familiar with Milgram's study as a whole, where people came in and they did the test, the learner and the teacher, and they had shock. And 80% of people continued shocking the learner even after they were vocal about the pain that they were in. And it was just all a ploy. The learner wasn't actually in any pain. It was a recording. That way every single participant felt they got the same information. So Milgram's study was definitely influenced by normative influence and informational. So in the normative sense, they didn't want to disappoint the experimenter. That was very important to them. And the experimenter actively tried to get people to conform. Whereas in informational social influence, the purpose was really ambiguous. The learner's outcries instigated a crisis situation, and the experimenters were considered experts. They were wearing the lab coats. They had ties on, and like their appearance had a lot of indication that they knew what they were talking about, and that was something that we discussed in a past class. So Jason Berger wrote an article discussing 4 different, how did he word these? 4 different situational features that contributed to the obedience and that kept the participants shocking. So the first one was the incremental nature of the task. So the foot in the door technique, the shocks seem very insignificant at first. It's just building up into a point, and then once you continue, then the shocks get more and more egregious. But if the first one seems little, then the next one doesn't seem that bad. And so as you continue, that's where the consistency comes in of minority influence. Because once the learners decided that their right, or once the teachers decided that the learner's rights didn't take precedence over the experimenter's rights, each act had to be consistent after that. And that's something that Berger said directly, because the whole point of minority influence is that you have to be consistent. And so they felt like they had to continue. And there was an idea of self-perception, which can be related to the normative social influence, because you want to be accepted. So if you feel like you're doing something wrong, then you're less likely to continue, and they wanted to feel like they're doing something right, so they wanted to impress the experimenter. The next factor that was the incremental nature of the task, and the next factor was the situation's novelty and the information that was made available. So normative influence plays into this because that's the type of information that was available, was normative information. The experimenter continued to encourage them despite the learner's outcries, and because the situation was so ambiguous and they didn't know what was going on, they looked to the experimenter for guidance and for experience. they had the role of the expert that's talked about in normative experience, and the crisis situation that we discussed before, where the learners' outcries instigated a crisis situation. They didn't know what was going on. They could have been delivering potentially fatal shocks, because at one point the learner stopped crying out and there was silence on the other end, and they discussed like a heart problem from the learner. So it was a crisis situation, and they looked towards the experts for their opinion. There's also a sense of minority influence in the descriptive norms. So the participants weren't allowed to see other participants, but the way that the expert carried themselves, where the shocks were nothing and they just needed to continue, suggested that other people continued. It wasn't clearly stated, and this is a personal inference that I've made, but they encourage them to keep going by not showing any sort of like reaction to the learner's outcry. If the experimenter had reacted, or if there were two experimenters like there were in some variations, if they had disagreed, then they would have been more likely to stop. But because they had no reaction and they encouraged them to continue, there were no other descriptive norms to tell them to stop. Another factor that encouraged the obedience of the participants was there was no opportunity to deny their responsibility or even like belittle their responsibility, so they had to do that themselves. But no, actually there was an opportunity. I misread that. So there was an opportunity to deny because they were anonymous, so they felt like they didn't have responsibility to it. And then Milgram set this up specifically for the learners. The recording that played addressed the teacher, or not the teacher, the experimenter. They begged the experimenter to stop, and so that took the responsibility off the teacher, who's the person shocking the participant, the person that's actually being studied. And that was a small part of the obedience. Berger discussed that wasn't really an important aspect. It was important, but it wasn't as significant, because in other situations where you could see there are many variations that went into Milgram's experiment after the original one, and they found that responsibility wasn't as big of a factor as these other three. And so this final factor that contributed to the obedience was the limited opportunity to ponder their decisions. They had to go at a very brisk pace. The experimenter, every time that there was a hesitation, they jumped in and said, okay, so the next question is, and would encourage the teacher to continue. So there was a cognitive overload with a time limitation, and because this would contribute to informational influence. So because they had no other thing to do, they conformed to the expertise of the experimenter. So just to review, Berger's article stated that there are 4 different situational factors that contributed to the participants continuing shocking, and those were the incremental nature of the task, the situation's novelty and the kind of info available, the opportunity to deny and diffuse the responsibility, and then also the limited opportunity to ponder decisions. And so the implications of that are very severe, indicating that potentially common people are capable of really egregious things. These participants were under the impression that they were potentially killing somebody that had a heart condition by shocking them, and yet they continued. To see that 80% of the participants continued to the final, not to the final shock, but continued shocking after the outcries, and 63% continued to the final shock, is really telling of like the different factors and how conformity and influence can affect most people. But that's all I have.